You know nothing, Jon Snow. Oh, well, obviously I'm not talking about that Jon Snow. I'm talking about Jon Snow with an H, who did some really bad stuff. We're up in the beautiful state of Maine for this one. It's near Christmas in 1923. Seems like a beautiful setting for a beautiful time of the year. And unfortunately, this would be the worst series of murders seen in Maine at this time. Jon Snow, aged 27, apparently felt the world was on his shoulders and there was not going to be any relief in sight. Rather than trudging through life trying to make things better, he decided he was going to end the lives of a bunch of people. And then his own. The man had people reaching out to him trying to provide help, but no. Instead, 5 people would have their lives ended by him. Who were his victims? Mrs. Lubell Jewett, wife of Sheriff Frank Jewett from Whitefield, 51 years old, married for 30 years, had 5 children. She had 2 sons still living at home, Kenneth and another son aged 12. The other kids were older and lived elsewhere. Her aforementioned son, Kenneth Jewett, age 15, from Whitefield. Mrs. Rule Brand, age 54, from Jefferson. Mrs. Eva Eaton, Rule's daughter, age 34, Jefferson. Mrs. Ida Snow, John's wife, Eva's niece, Rule's granddaughter, age 18, Jefferson. The 5 were dead in only a few hours' time. In these homes for which 5 were murdered, there was one who remained unharmed, Jon Snow's 2-month-old daughter. It was December 23, 1923, 10 o'clock a.m. Mrs. Jewett and her son were killed in their home in Whitefield. John took their car, drove the 9 miles to his house in Jefferson, where 3 generations of women from the same family were murdered. And hence, this is also the place he took his life, approximately 1 p.m. So what had been done that may have saved things but didn't, and in fact, I'm wondering if it was a catalyst. Apparently, John and his wife were estranged, but John had received a Christmas card from his wife that very morning that read, quote, "My dear John, I wish you a Merry Christmas. I want you to come up. The baby is growing. Well, goodbye, from Ida Snow." End quote. Well, that sounds cautious, but also like a hand reaching out. Except it's also been said that he was known as a bad person in the area who had threatened people in the town of Jefferson. In August 1923, Snow had been brought into court because he threatened harm on a man named Arthur Davis if Davis cut the hay in a certain field. Now, I grew up in the country, so I get being territorial about your stuff, but I need a lot more information here. Okay. So apparently there was a $200 bond on John. I think his grandmother-in-law, Rule Brand, one of the victims, took care of those bonds and he was permitted to stay in her home. But soon he became really horrible to the family and she decided that she didn't want him in her house anymore for fear of everyone's safety. So she asked that the sheriff take him into the sheriff's custody. So he had been in the custody of Sheriff Frank Jewett in the Jewett's home. Jewett, sound familiar? John had been in custody of the Jewett home for 6 weeks. Sheriff Jewett was on his way back home from another town and on entering his home found the body of his 15-year-old son, Kenneth. Lubell, the sheriff's wife, was found in another room by someone who had come into the home with the sheriff. So why was someone with him? The sheriff was actually coming back home because he had heard that John was making trouble in Jefferson and the sheriff purposely drove by his home to check on things. Well, things weren't good. Kenneth was lying face down on the floor of the sitting room, shot in the forehead and in 3 other places. Lubell, the sheriff's wife, had been shot in the face twice and had 2 other bullet wounds. The coroner felt that the murder to Lubell had actually happened in the kitchen, and her body had been dragged into the bedroom due to faint traces of blood being found on the floor of the kitchen, through the dining room, and into the hall, and then into the bedroom. Kenneth, by his appearance, looked like he had just come in from the outside. There was nothing else to indicate the events leading up to the shooting. They could only speculate about the order of events, which was that John, somehow upset over his Christmas card, came into the Jewett house where he had been staying in the sheriff's custody, got his gun out of the desk where the sheriff had been keeping it, and shot Mrs. Jewett. And then Kenneth had returned home and was killed. John stole their car and headed to the Brand home. The sheriff, on discovering the bodies, went to the desk to see if John's revolver was still there. It was not. The other murder scene was discovered by Ernest Brand, son of Mrs. Rule Brand, and Percy Eaton, son of Eva Eaton. They had come to the house where they found the door locked, which may have been odd in and of itself back in these cozier small-town times. They looked in the window in the back of the house and saw Mrs. John Snow dead. Her name is Ida, and John, who was dying. They broke into the house, and in the kitchen they found the body of Mrs. Rule Brand. John and his wife were in an adjoining room. Eva Eaton was found in yet another room at the foot of a bed. Percy, Eva's son, ran away in what I'm guessing was fear or horror and was not seen for a long time. I don't know his age, but I believe he was young. Ernest, now left in the house, raised the alarm to alert the police. Neighbors came and took the 2-month-old baby home with them to care for her while things got, sorted out. The medical examiner for Lincoln County, Dr. J.E. Oriorn, along with the county attorney, Weston M. Hilton, looked at the Jewett bodies, looked at the Brand bodies, and declared it was a case of murder times 5 and 1 suicide. John had used a .38 Eastern Arms revolver. So John had stolen the Jewett car, according to residents along the road between the Jewetts and the Brands. They saw the car racing at a high rate of speed. From what I understand and could glean, people didn't think anything of it, as they probably couldn't tell that it wasn't the sheriff driving his own car. Sheriff's going to speed if something's going on, right? Except it wasn't the sheriff driving. So we're thinking, bad person, bad temper. Everyone saw this coming. No one's surprised, right? Sheriff had said that John was actually a model prisoner. I guess the sheriff owned a lumber mill and John worked there, plus did chores around the house and had grown fond of the 2 Jewett boys that still lived at home, one of whom was now dead. So now John arrives at the Brand house in the Jewett car. So what happens? Witnesses passing by saw John going into the Brand house with his arm around the shoulder of his wife, and what people had assumed was a friendly sidearm type of hug, kind of a, come here you, let's go see what's for lunch. Then they heard a shot after they had passed the murder house, but thought little of it. There were woods nearby, and they thought it was probably kids hunting. We just saw them hugging. Couldn't be anything nefarious there. So, again, conjecture over what happened at the Brand house, as all who were there are dead, except for the 2-month-old. But it was thought that the first victim was Mrs. Rule Brand, who was found nearby. Heading for the rear of the house, John passed through the room of Eva, who he killed, and by all appearances she had fought with everything she had. The foot of the bed was broken off, and she was found at the foot of the bed as if she was trying to get underneath the bed in some sort of last-ditch effort to try to save herself. Not only was he killing his victims purposefully, but he was apparently just wildly shooting, it was said. So why is his wife considered the last to be murdered? Well, it's thought actually that he had already murdered Rule and Eva. His wife then ran from the house terrified. He went after her, and at that point was seen bringing her back into the house forcefully rather than the loving side hug gestures witnesses saw driving by. He dragged her into the room where their 2-month-old baby was, and Ida's body was found near the stairs to the attic, where they believe she may have tried to flee. Very near to her was John's body. I read in another non-newspaper account that John was actually alive at this time, but was unable to make a statement, and then I'm assuming he died on the same spot. A mystery trunk had been found in the house, locked with a combination padlock and wires and a bell, but when it was finally broken into by authorities after the fact, it only held John's things. Why a bell? The newspaper said, quote, evidently a working of the demented man's mind, end quote. Was he trying to construct a crude bomb or alarm system if someone tried to get into his trunk? It was assumed that John was angry at being taken away from his wife and child, and I guess not really seeing that all of that was happening was because of him, the way he is. The family had intended to move to Togus to live, and Snow wanted to go with them. So, sounds like the story's over, right? No, not quite. So John was buried on the Brand farm, some 300 or so yards from the road. There was no ceremony. It was on Christmas Eve. So why here? Why on the property where he killed 3 people, his wife's family? Well, the farm was apparently actually the property of the town of Jefferson, and the town had allowed the Brand family to live there rent-free, for one. And for 2, the citizens of the town didn't want this man anywhere near the local cemetery, which is where his victims were intended to be buried. Later that same day, a service for the 3 women was held, conducted by a reverend, and the ladies were buried side by side in the Shepherd Cemetery in West Jefferson. The funerals for the Jewett family had not taken place just yet, as they were awaiting out-of-town family. Remember, the Jewetts had 3 older children who had moved away from home at this point. At this moment, the daughter of Ida and John Snow is still being cared for by their neighbor, Mrs. Cooper. Ernest Brand, age 27, who is one of the discoverers and the son of Mrs. Rule, is staying with a friend. Percy, son of Eva, who was also there to discover the bodies and ran in terror, is living with his father. Well, we're now going to witness some Christmas-time grave desecration. An alleged group of people went to John's grave in the middle of the night, removed his body, dragged it along the ground, and back into the Brand's house, put it in the room where he had done some murdering, and burned the body. Neighbors saw the flames that were now enveloping the Brand house. Lincoln County was unable to discover who the grave desecrators were, and frankly had little intention to make much of an effort if you take the newspaper account as fact. People in the area witnessed the blaze and seemed to have no desire to go see what was up, which, if you're in a small town and there's a house afire, you're gonna go look. So that's interesting to me. By the morning, when some did decide to go have a gander, the house was in ruins. Some charred bones were found and were put back into the dug-up grave. To be honest with you, house burning down was probably for the best. The house would always be a pariah of the community, the thing pointed out every time somebody drove by. See that there? 3 people were murdered there, and the murderer took his own life, plus 2 more. Rumors of it being haunted, getting vandalized, etc., etc. So County Attorney Weston M. Hilton has not decided to just forego the search for the ones who did the grave desecration. He's out and about in the town asking questions, and it's his belief as of now that it's not an act of vengeance, but actually superstition. One unnamed resident said that he had been out that night looking for the ghosts of the women. Apparently, burning the body of the murderer would allow his victims to rest in peace. Now remember, kids, we're also in the era of some heavy spiritualistic beliefs, so perhaps that really is at play here. County Attorney Hilton thinks that there has to have been more than one person involved and that he will go the limit to find those people. What was allegedly left of Jon Snow's body was pretty inconsequential, which makes me wonder, were parts of his body taken away too? You have to have a pretty freaking hot fire to cremate bones. I watch Ask the Mortician. I know a few things. In any case, it was observed that someone had put a crude kind of tree cross on the side of his grave where those paltry remains were reburied. Eugene Brand, son of Mrs. Rule Brand, hopes those who did it are caught and punished. Brand had placed stones at the foot and head of the grave, allegedly, and I guess he's of the belief that grave desecration is indeed wrong no matter whose grave it is. The state has taken possession of the Snow daughter, who is now named Marion in the articles, and she was taken to Augusta and placed in one of the boarding homes there by someone on the Charities Board. December 29, 1923. Unfortunately, the baby daughter has died of pneumonia, thought to be because of her exposure to cold in the Brand house on the day of the slayings and lack of thick clothing, and through shifting her to the neighbors for care during the investigation. At the time she was moved from the neighbors to Augusta, she was well. That was on a Thursday. By Friday at 2 p.m., she had passed away. Now, what I'm about to mention was not in the newspaper. I actually found some information about the Jewett family where years later, one of the members recounted that the baby had actually lived and had been adopted by a family, done in secrecy so that the baby would never know what had happened to her parents, would not have had a clue as to who her parents even were, and she would live with anonymity. This sounds very Hollywood, and again, I don't know if this is true, but honestly, I hope it is. The newspaper comments on the fact that the authorities seem to want to drop the investigation into Snow's grave desecration. Quote, there are many reasons for concluding that such an attitude on the part of the town would, in the end, prove more injurious to the community's good name than was the deed itself. Kindliness and hospitality are wonderful. They brighten the world and contribute to its joy and happiness beyond any measuring. But hospitality is to be tempered with caution and judgment. Otherwise, it may be wasted or much worse than wasted. End quote. You think we're done? Ah, sweet summer child. Nope. Reverend Andrew T. McWhorter said, quote, as a minister of the gospel, I protest against anyone being buried without some form of religious ceremony. End quote. He's pointed out that this lack of service may have propagated the desecration and burning of the body, which he condemned as a barbarous thing, a senseless act of which no good could have come of it. So we're into the new year now of 1924. Attorney General Bansford W. Shaw intends to ramp up what little investigation there has been into the grave desecrators and declares that those perpetrators be found, arrested, and brought to justice. County Attorney Hilton has still been trying on his own, but after meeting with A.G. Shaw, it was decided a vigorous investigation would start forthwith. It's felt that the community itself couldn't really give a crap about this, but the state and county do. It's thought that County Attorney Hilton already has some idea of the ones who had done it, but he needs more evidence. The Charities Board, who was supposed to have taken the daughter into their care and she died, no, I'm not accusing, just stating facts, and perhaps it was all a lie anyway and the daughter had actually lived. Sorry, backtracking. Anywho, the Charities Board were looking into John Snow a bit. He apparently had been married before Ida to a woman named Josephine who died in 1920. They had 3 children by this marriage. These children were taken by the Department of Welfare in 1920. John had made a few efforts of support payments and then by spring of 1921 they lost track of him. The oldest daughter had actually stayed with her father for a bit, and then he placed her into another family himself. The welfare board was trying to have that child, his oldest daughter, taken in as the father had not been heard of. Obviously, this is all prior to all of the murders. It was unfortunately believed that even if the mother had lived and John Snow had been around, the children would not have been any better off and would have been committed to the Charities Board as neither were particularly caring of their children. So what happened with all of this? You've been leading us around on a weird leash and we need closure. What happened, kids? Nothing. As far as I can tell, and I would think at least the local newspapers would have been all over it if something had, none of the grave desecrators were ever caught. More than likely, people knew exactly who these people were, but protected them. And once again, we're left wondering why. John Snow had a reputation as being a bit of a jerk, to put it mildly. He had done some bad things, but seemed to, at least on appearances, to be putting things a bit more right. Yes, he was in the custody of the sheriff. He wasn't in an actual prison. He was living with a family. He was kept busy by working. His wife reached out to him that she wanted him to come visit and see their child. And if that is indeed what set him off, why? He obviously didn't want to keep the child for himself, or he wouldn't have killed himself. He would have left the home with the child. Well, sometimes we just don't know. And we'll never know.